So let's go back, Narad, to the time when you returned from the ashram in 1962 back to America. How did you live your return?
Barely. But first I wrote to Mother, and it had to do with my parents. So I'd like to quote, read the entire letter because Mother answers.
Your parents were still alive,
Yes, both were alive.
and they were aware of your inclination towards India and Mother in Sri Aurobindo?
Yes, and that was a big problem for them because, well, my mother's faith, the Russian Orthodox faith, and it was like I was the black sheep.
Okay.
I left the fold,
Okay.
and people were deeply hurt. Prior to that, it's very interesting. I told my mother I wanted to go to India and I wanted to go to Cuba and see the revolution. So my mother said, "Well, you can go to Cuba, but if you don't go to India." So I went to Cuba. And I had the most incredible experience. I went down there with some people who were probably communists, but I didn't know at the time.
But did you have any communist leanings?
No,
Never.
never.
Okay.
Never. And I got to Cuba, and it was the most amazing experience. I saw the women and the girls in uniforms marching with rifles. I met two fellows, both musicians, two older men, guitarists, in a small club that some friends took me to. And I sang them one line of a song in Russian, which they loved, and immediately they knew the whole song and played it for me. So we played and sang and had a wonderful time. And then these two fellows, they were very dark-skinned, took me to this great seaside, extravagant place where Batista used to host foreigners, Westerners. They said to me, a black man couldn't even shine shoes in this place. And now Fidel has opened everything to us. And so the beautiful beaches, the white beaches, everything were accessible to everyone. And then day comes when I go to this little town of Regla, where everything is white sails and blue sea. I mean, Havana was a beautiful place, absolutely beautiful. And I meet this family, and they are so poor, and yet they welcome me, and he spends, I think, all of his money one Sunday to buy a chicken and to feed us a chicken. Well, from there, I went back to Havana, and Fidel was giving a talk to 400,000 people in this gigantic plaza. And Che Guevara let me go up and use his office to photograph this with my father's moving picture camera, we called it at that time. And so I returned to the States on the day the embargo started. I had a girlfriend there in this little town of Regla, and her mother, and my mother wanted to send them all kinds of clothing because they were so poor, and the embargo stopped it all. We couldn't mail anything. But unfortunately, Castro got caught between two superpowers,
Right.
and the Russians presided.
Yeah.
So then I told my mother I have to go to India next year. A lot of tears, and I went, and I told you of my journey. So then I write to Mother, before I leave, my parents have written me asking me to help with my father's business, landscaping, but I feel uncomfortable with them, because of their religious views. And of course my way is through music at this time. Please tell me what the divine wishes me to do in these very important matters, and I shall follow faithfully and with joy. Mother, thank you. You have given me everything. Yours, Richard. Mother writes, in between these lines, will they not understand if you tell them frankly that you have a way of your own? And then she writes at the bottom of the letter, one of those things that will carry me through many lives. Go on boldly, following your way with joy and confidence, taking great care of one thing only, never to forget the divine.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So I go back, and I go back to my parents' home, which is in this beautiful area of northern New Jersey, near the Tappan Zee Bridge, the Hudson River. It's called Old Tappan, where there's a great history of Americana, because Washington was there and Benedict Arnold was captured there. And so I begin working for my father, and then this happens. I have rarely spoken of this first darshan with Sri Aurobindo, his blessing and grace that opened my soul and determined my path. The beauty and intensity of that meeting, occurring in dream vision, of all places, my parents' home in New Jersey, where I returned on a visit after my first stay in the ashram and my first meeting with Mother and her initiation of this soul. I wrote to Mother immediately after meeting Sri Aurobindo on 2 successive nights, and Pavitra replied that Mother confirmed my experiences as genuine, but I should not attempt a mental reconstruction of them. Pavitra also wrote more, and I'll say that at the end. Now that this was, when I wrote this, 54 years had passed, now much more has passed. I feel I've been given the blessing to share this first meeting with the Lord. And I'll speak of all 3 experiences I had with Sri Aurobindo in the recent times. As with my second experience, which I have written of earlier, I entered a great hall in a palace-like structure in the subtle physical, Sri Aurobindo's permanent dwelling. Sri Aurobindo was seated on a couch and gently motioned me to come and sit with him. As I sat down at his side, he extended his arm and placed his hand on my abdomen, fully outstretched to touch my chest as well. In that moment, some of the strands of his silken hair fell between his fingers and pressed against my chest. I don't know how many times the psychic tears have poured from me, reliving that moment, a moment that would forever change my life. Nothing more need be said, for he is with me always now, as his mother, guiding, protecting, and giving me the strength to surrender fully, offering all my life to them. And then, right after that, I wrote this poem called Meeting. When I was 12, the Lord of love withdrew this earth, for which he sacrificed his life. I did not see his golden form aglow, and nothing knew of the fierce and endless strife, or his lonely years of battle with the foe. Yet twice I met him at his residence, a dwelling place in subtle matters field, a splendid room of occult radiance. Seated on his couch, imperial, he motioned me to join him on his right, and I, unknowing of the inexpressible grace, sat at his side, bathed in his force and light. Imprinted in my soul's eternal space, the moment supreme in which my life was blessed from birth to birth. I shall remember when Sri Aurobindo turned to me and pressed so gently his hand upon my abdomen. Between his fingers the strands of his silver hair, soft against my yielding flesh, and then I wept, as lo, I've wept these 40 years, remembering his touch, these psychic tears.
Marvelous.
Okay, this was the second time, and after that I'll wait a bit for the last meeting. This was September 21st, 1965. There was a gathering, now I'm in Sri Aurobindo's home in the subtle physical. There was a gathering of people, and coming toward me was Sri Aurobindo. He was speaking with another person while walking toward me. He seemed to be in a supramental body, which appeared to be pure air. He was fully dressed, but I cannot now recall his mode of apparel. As he came to me, I gave him a furious look, filled with anger, hostility, etc. I believe I was vehement about the appearance of his supramental body. It reminded me of H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, who was only visible when wearing clothing. At any rate, Sri Aurobindo came up to me and said, "What a look!" in a light, humorous way. He was, of course, completely untouched by my look. Then I asked him, in a furious manner, I cannot remember this verbatim, to answer me, yes or no, whether he had touched me the other evening. He replied something to the effect, "What kind of question is that?" Once again, very humorously, I could not accept this, and actually demanded an answer. He turned, with a person or persons still at his side, and walking away to the right of me, lovingly, smilingly, replied, "I did." Here the dream ended, but I awakened abruptly, filled with sorrow and anger with myself for having spoken to the Master in such a way. I did not return to sleep for some time, and while awake and sitting up in bed, one word kept recurring: humility, humility, humility. I finally got to sleep, but when I awoke in the morning, I was still deeply troubled by my actions towards the Master. Pavitra wrote back, "I received your letter and delayed a little to answer you because I wanted to show it to Mother. She said your dream was authentic and good. She sends you her blessings. On my side, I am quite happy to have been a link in bringing you closer to the Mother. The Mother also said that you need not try to reconstruct the dream, for it may bring a mental deformation of it which will be useless. Have confidence. Similar experience will come to you in the future." So now I go back and...
I have a little question for you, Narad,
sure,
here,
sure.
because you mentioned this word humility. You know, I've seen with a lot of my friends who were brought up in a Western education of individualism, that this leap into the spiritual dimension, one of the greatest obstacles for them is this idea of surrender.
I fully agree.
And how did you overcome this conditioning of your own Western education?
My friend H.P. Rama says, "You're an Indian soul in a Western body." And I think I'd have to leave it at that.
Okay.
But in 1964, Mother sends me this birthday. Oh, it's wonderful. On Fed Richard at the time, huh?
Yeah.
To Richard, with love and blessings for a luminous and progressive year. And then she puts in Sri Aurobindo's comment. It is by a constant inner growth that one can find a constant newness and unfailing interest in life. And those two meetings set my soul on the path of the integral yoga. And after that, nothing could come in the way, intervene. I was an altar boy when I was very young. I mean, I served a 5 o'clock mass in the church, and then I had all this experience with the Russian Orthodox people, who were fine people, wonderful people, very loving people, but an insular group. So now I want to tell you about the most amazing and somewhat poignant experience, because when I went back, even though the vital was still not able to live in the ashram at that moment, I wanted to work for Mother. And Mother gave me this work to bring the handmade paper to America. And I have to read this because I can't remember it all. But at that time, there were two major companies in the world making the highest quality watercolor paper, famous throughout the world. Whatman Papers from England, and the second, an Italian firm. The Whatman Paper Company was facing a difficult time as labor costs were skyrocketing. And they were at a point where they were contemplating having to discontinue production, which in fact they did. I visited Mr. Dyson, head of the Whatman Paper Division in Manhattan, and showed him samples of the quality of the ashram papers. He was most interested and suggested I write the preeminent watercolor artists in the U.S. to ask for their evaluation. I did so, sending them all full-size sample, the big size. The responses were amazing, Maurice. It was, every one of the artists sent me rave reviews and asked when the paper would be available. And I remember these names. So I then asked Mother for a name for the papers, and she gave me the name Arvind. Arvind Watercolor Papers. I took the replies from the American artist to Mr. Dyson, and he immediately ordered a ream of 500 sheets, 22 by 30 inches. This was to begin a long and difficult period for me in my offering to Mother. The first ream was sent and was improperly packaged, and all the papers were spoiled when seawater entered. Mr. Dyson informed me. I went to see him. I humbly apologized and told him I would have another ream on its way as soon as possible. There were many letters going back and forth, rather unpleasant, from an American fellow who was representing the handmade paper department, and they were not pleasant letters. The next ream was sent, And Mr. Dyson called me and told me that the paper was filled with black spots and could not be sold, and that was that. I was deeply saddened because it could have meant hundreds of thousands of dollars for Mother, if not millions, because there was only that one company, and this was the best, far better than the Italian company's paper. But the department representative was intransigent, saying I should make do with what they produced. I wrote everything to Mother, and she said, if the ashram could not meet the world standards, I would have to drop the work. At this point, I met a man in Long Island, New York. He was making watercolor papers in his basement, and they were superb. He said that if I would agree to pay his passage to the ashram and his return to the U.S., he would teach them how to make the best paper. I wrote to Mother, hoping this might be the solution, and I could go back to Mr. Dyson, hat in hand, and with profuse apologies, ask if we might try once more. And the above is one of the most extraordinary letters I ever received from Mother, and I would ask you to read it.
This is all a dream in the air and cannot be realized. Blessings.